All right, everybody, we're going to get started. This is Emily again. For those of you who know LenFest well, you might not recognize my voice. I'm Emily Knight. I'm the new outreach manager with LenFest, so I am just starting my second month now. So really excited to join the team, and thanks everybody for signing on to this webinar. So just a little bit about LenFest. It's a scientific grant-making program that funds projects that will help inform current and emerging marine policy questions. And if you're interested to learn more about LenFest, you can find us online at lenfestocean.org, on Twitter at LenFestOcean. On our website, you can sign up for our newsletter where you can learn every month about the various things that we're doing. So for today, we are joined by Dr. Andre Buchheister from Humboldt State University, who will be discussing his work creating a new model to fully explore options for managing Atlantic menhaden, the largest fishery on the East Coast. Dr. Buchheister will be speaking about his results for the first 30 minutes, and then we will have time for questions and answers. All lines have been placed on mute in order to prevent any background noise. To ask a question, please type your question in the Q&A panel, and at the end, Dr. Buchheister will read it aloud and provide you an answer. So without further ado, I will turn it over to Dr. Buchheister.
Hi, thank you, Emily. Before I start, I just want to check, can everyone hear me okay? Emily, you sound everything coming through all right?
Yep, we hear you fine.
Excellent. Well, it's a pleasure to be able to join you online today. And as Emily said, I'll be talking about some of the work that I conducted as a postdoc, and I want to start off by thanking my collaborators, Drs. Tom Miller and Ed Hood, who are at the University of Maryland Center for Environmental Science. This has been a project that's been ongoing for several years, and we're excited to have a paper published and to continue engaging with the management process. So just a quick outline for the talk today. I'll be first talking about some of the background and objectives of the work. I'll briefly touch on some of the methods and then focus on the results, and as well as some discussion items. Now this is a highlight and overview of more extensive work, and if you're interested, I will direct you to the paper that is published in Marine and Coastal Fisheries, which you can download for free online. Also, I wanted to draw your attention to a short fact sheet that LenFest has developed on this project, and that's available through the lenfestocean.org website. I imagine most of you that are listening in are familiar with Atlantic menhaden, but just in case you aren't, Atlantic menhaden is a highly abundant clupid forage fish located throughout the eastern seaboard, and it provides very important services within the ecosystem. To start off with, it does support the largest directed fishery on the East Coast, largely through perch seining activities. The fishery is broken up into two different sectors. There's a reduction fishery in which the fish are cooked and processed, oils are removed and used in anything from livestock feeds to dietary supplements, and then the fish meal is also used for animal feeds primarily. The bait sector of the fishery is smaller. It represents about 25% of the total catch, and here menhaden are sold whole for other fisheries, particularly pot fisheries for lobster and crab. So it supports a very large directed fishery, but it's also an important forage fish within the system, acting as a conduit between lower trophic levels and higher trophic levels. So they have many predators, many of which are fished both commercially and recreationally. Here we see a schematic of some of those predators, things like bluefish, striped bass, and weakfish. They also support a number of different birds and marine mammals. And some of these larger predatory piscivorous fishes also support their own fisheries in their own right. So one of the challenges with managing forage fish like Atlantic menhaden is that you have these potentially conflicting objectives, supporting a fishery and supporting predators, and it can be difficult to try to bridge these two objectives. And one of the methods to do that is to use an ecosystem approach to fisheries management as well as ecological reference points. So let me go into what those are briefly. So this ecosystem approach to fisheries management is one method within a larger gradient of management approaches. Traditionally, fisheries have been managed as single species, focusing simply on the individual species and its harvest. But there are approaches that account for multiple species simultaneously, including predators, and then it's also possible to manage and model entire ecosystems. And so the idea of EAFM is to build some of these broader ecosystem considerations into the single species approaches that have been more traditional. One of the ways to do that is to develop what are called ecological reference points, or ERPs. These are reference points that account for those broader considerations. For example, sustaining predators within the environment. So Atlantic menhaden are managed by the Atlantic States Marine Fisheries Commission. Recently, they've conducted an update to the stock assessment and determined that the stock is not overfished and overfishing is not occurring. But the fishery management plan is being amended. Currently, there's a draft amendment 3 that is out for public comment. The main goal for this amendment 3 is to manage the fishery in a manner that is equitable, allocating the resources, ecological and economic benefits between all user groups, which would include the predators within the system as well as different sectors of the fishery. So ASMFC is receiving public comments, and come November they will be making their final determinations on the amendment. As part of this process, they're considering 5 different options of ecological reference points. This is one of the goals of the amendment, is to decide what to do with these ecological reference points. And I've listed the 5 options here, and they largely focus on what to do in the interim before menhaden-specific ERPs are developed. And so options B through E would entail a working group to continue developing ecological reference points for menhaden, but in the interim using a variety of different approaches that have been recommended in the literature. So options C, D, and E represent some rules of thumb and empirical analyses that have empirical recommendations that are available. So I mentioned this working group. There's a group called the Biological Ecological Reference Point Work Group, or the BERP. This is a group that's been tasked with developing ERPs specifically for menhaden, and they've drafted a series of different modeling approaches that could be used for developing these reference points. Now, the details of this table aren't very important, but it's a gradient of increasing complexity of different approaches that could be used for that purpose. On the lower end here, we have an EcoPath with EcoSim ecosystem model. So this is the most complex option that they recommended as being viable for this purpose, but they haven't been able to pursue that. And our group has been trying to collaborate with the BERP to accomplish the task of developing this ecosystem model to help inform their management process. So with that in mind, the objectives of our work were to first build an ecosystem model that could be used as a tool to aid those management decisions, and then secondarily to evaluate potential ecosystem impacts of different fishing mortality rates. And then lastly, we wanted to compare the performance of different ERPs to see what impact they might have on the system as a whole and on the fisheries that are operating within the environment. And again, the idea is to try to shift our management from a solely single species approach to incorporate these broader ecosystem considerations. So the modeling approach that we used is this EcoPath with EcoSim, or EWE, and it's really comprised of two different modules. The first one is EcoPath, and you can think of this as a snapshot of a complex system at a given point in time. And so here you see a schematic of what a sample ecosystem might look like, where you have different bubbles representing different groups of organisms within the system, and then the lines represent those linkages, in other words, who's eating whom in the system. So the EcoPath is a snapshot of the system, and then we can look at how that system will change through time using the EcoSim module. So this is the time dynamic part of the model, and we have time series of data for different groups. Again, this is a schematic, a representation, but if we have data going through time, we can make predictions, which would be the lines on this graph, and see how well we can match up with observed data. And once we've calibrated the model, we can use this to ask policy questions and conduct management strategy evaluations to help inform the decision-making process. So to simplify the underlying theory and equations, I put together this slide here. The model is based on two master equations, which you see on the bottom left. One is this production equation, and the other is this consumption equation. So the consumption equation really is just a conservation of mass, right? What's consumed is the source of the biomass for a predator. So if we look at predator A here, all of its biomass is represented by this pie. And so let's assume that it's only eating a forage fish and an invertebrate. So it's removing biomass for each of those groups, represented by the yellow predation slices. And that biomass that's consumed, some of it is lost through respiration, some of it is passed through the system as unassimilated food. What's left over is available for harvest and for predation by other groups and a few other things. And so these equations are a way of characterizing and monitoring where the biomass and energy is flowing within the system. And these connections are done for all combinations of groups within the system, and we can express these equations through time to fill out that EcoSim part of the model. For as complex of a model as it is, the data needs are relatively simple, and here's the list of things that we need to build one of these models. So of these first four bolded parameters, we only have to enter 3 of those into the model. The first parameter here is a production to biomass ratio. You can think of this as a total mortality rate for each group. The second component is a consumption to biomass ratio, so the amount of feeding that's occurring. We need to know the biomasses for each group. And then this ecotrophic efficiency parameter is something that we'll typically estimate within the model. Of course, we'll need some information on diet compositions, and then we can bring in other sources of data such as time series of catches, fishing mortality, growth parameters, et cetera. But most of these parameters are coming from stock assessments, coming from the literature, from fishery surveys, and so big task is just aggregating all this information from diverse sources. So the model that we've built is termed the NWax ecosystem model, or the Northwest Atlantic Continental Shelf model. And it represents a single spatial domain ranging from North Carolina all the way up to the Gulf of Maine. It also includes some of the dominant estuaries, such as Chesapeake Bay, Pamlico Sound, and Delaware Bay, throughout this region. We've been able to gather data from 1982 to 2013, and we've calibrated the model for that time period, and then we can use it to project forward into the future. We've modeled fishing fleets in 8 groups, which you see listed here, so we definitely account for some of the large players in the system, including purse seines and trawls and traps and gill nets and a variety of others. Now, the number of species in the system is very high, and we've simplified it down to 61 different trophic groups. These groups range from phytoplankton all the way up to whales and sharks, capturing the span and range of organisms. And we have modeled 8 of those groups with multiple age classes, which I'll show you in just a second. So here's a list of all of the groups within the model, broken up into different categories. And this is just to represent that we are capturing a diversity of organisms, largely broken up into functional groups. For the fishes in particular, you can see that we do have them broken out by species. Here's Menhaden as a forage fish. And for some of these key groups, including Menhaden and some of their dominant predators, we have broken them up into different size classes, or more accurately, age classes, and that allows us to account for size-selective predation and size-selective harvest of these different groups. We've used lots of literature and survey data to parameterize diets within the model, and I wanted to show you the fraction that Menhaden comprise within the diets of predators. So on the x-axis here, we see different predators that are consuming Atlantic Menhaden, and we can see what fraction of the diet Menhaden comprise. And so we see, for example, large striped bass have almost a third of their diet coming from Atlantic Menhaden based on the literature and extensive studies that we examined. We see some other groups here, some large pelagic, highly migratory species, and some nearshore piscivorous birds like ospreys and cormorants and bald eagles, also having strong reliance on Menhaden. So moving on to the results, here's what the Northwest Atlantic ecosystem looks like. Quite a complex web, and this is very typical of what we see in large marine ecosystems. And so again, each bubble here, each node represents a different trophic group. You don't have to read the names, but they're organized from lower trophic levels, so your primary producers here on the bottom, moving up to your apex predators up at the top. Those lines represent the trophic linkages within the system, so if a group is consumed, we have a line drawn on there. And again, this is very typical for these complex systems that are highly connected. So here I've highlighted Menhaden, and some interesting points are that they are consumed by 22 predators within the system. So nearly 1/3 of all of the groups in our model eat Menhaden, at least to some degree. And Menhaden eat 6 prey groups that we've modeled. So that was the snapshot of the system back in 1982, and then we can simulate things through time and calibrate the model to observe data. So here's a multi-panel plot with each panel representing a different group within the model. For example, here we have shrimp, here we have herring, we see small Menhaden, medium Menhaden, so on and so forth. let me highlight the Menhaden here. Each point represents the relative biomass from a stock assessment or from a fisheries survey, and then the red line is the model prediction. So we can see that for Menhaden, we're doing a really good job predicting changes in Menhaden biomass through time. And I'll also highlight striped bass here in green. So this panel on the second row is for small striped bass, and then we have medium striped bass and large striped bass. And we can see that we're capturing the rebound of the striped bass population after the moratorium in the 80s. So we are matching many of these groups really well, and then there's some groups that we don't match as well, and it's a trade-off given that we're looking at a complex system. And what we can do is use this model to then project forward into the future what's happening. And what you see plotted here is the total biomass of Atlantic Menhaden summed across each of those age classes. So again, the points are the observed data, the line is the model prediction. So we're doing a pretty good job, and we want to project forward into the future. And so we can control the knobs in this model. You can think of it as a big mixing board where each channel, each set of knobs represents a different species. So our strategy was, let's keep fishing mortality and fishing effort constant at status quo levels moving into the future. And then let's only adjust the amount of fishing mortality for Menhaden to see what the consequences are. So we can run this forward through time, looking at impacts of different fishing mortality rates. So here, each line on this graph represents a different fishing mortality rate, with green being no fishing on Menhaden, and as we ramp up fishing, we see that we're fishing them out of the system. And so this upper green line would represent the unfished biomass, or B0, for Menhaden, so the expected biomass if we didn't fish them at all. Then what we can do is we can essentially take a slice after the system has kind of equilibrated and settled down to a new stable state. We can then compare, well, how does Menhaden biomass compare across these different fishing mortality scenarios, taking a slice at the end of this projection. And so not only can we look at differences in biomass, but we can also look at differences in yield, and we can do that for each group. And so the performance measures that we examined were the differences in biomass, the differences in yield, and each of those were standardized to some metric so that they all range from 0 to 1. And then we also looked at the percentage of groups that were either positively or negatively impacted, and I'll be showing you those results in just a second. And so there's lots of other types of metrics that we can calculate and examine. For example, in the paper we talk about prey-to-predator biomass ratios, but I won't talk about those today. So for the results, really kind of focusing in on two sets of results. The two panels that you see here are the relative biomass on the left and the relative yield on the right as a function of Menhaden fishing mortality rate. So I'll draw your attention to the right panel first. Each line represents a different group in the system. So the black line represents Menhaden, the green line represents striped bass, the red line is weak fish, and the blue line is bluefish. So as we ramp up fishing mortality, our yield of Menhaden is going to increase. It will reach a maximum at the MSY level, and then it'll start to decline. And we can see, well, what happens with the yield of other groups as we start to ramp up fishing mortality on Menhaden. We can see that striped bass are declining, whereas the others are not. So we can look at these types of trade-offs and comparisons in terms of relative yield across groups. And then also, excuse me, the panel on the left, we can look at relative biomass. So we can see that the biomass of both striped bass and menhaden are declining substantially as menhaden are fished out of the system. So we do see that striped bass of the groups that we've plotted here are the ones that are most sensitive to changes in menhaden fishing. The reason I selected these groups were because they're of particular management interest. Weak fish and bluefish, the red and blue lines, are showing negligible responses to menhaden fishing mortality rates. And we can generate similar types of plots for any of the modeled groups. We've focused on these because they're of most interest to the managers. So we can also look at who are the losers and who are the winners in the system. Anytime you perturb a system, some species will benefit and others will not. So here we have two panels. The panel on the left, again, our x-axis is the menhaden fishing mortality rate, so higher fishing on the right. On the left, we're looking at what percentage of all of the groups in the system are being negatively impacted. So the red line represents the proportion of groups that are declining by over 25%. So if a group's biomass declines by more than 25%, we'll call that a loser or a negatively impacted group. We can use a more stringent threshold and say, well, how many groups are declining by 50%? So we can see that as we ramp up fishing mortality rate, the proportion of groups in the system that are showing these negative impacts is increasing. So if we essentially extirpate menhaden from the system at these really high fishing mortality rates, roughly a quarter of the modeled groups will have measurable declines in biomass. The right panel represents the winners, the positively impacted groups, with the red lines, again, representing the degree to which they're benefiting. And we can see a much flatter line that doesn't reach the altitude that the losers do. On the bottom, I've highlighted some of the top groups that are either negatively or positively impacted. So obviously, menhaden are negatively affected because we're fishing them directly and hard at these high scenarios. Striped bass, nearshore piscivorous birds, large pelagic migratory species, coastal sharks, and seabirds are kind of the losers in the system, if you will. The winners in the system that benefit from increased removal of menhaden include things like medium pelagics and cod and anchovies and eulocines. And all of these effects are due to a variety of direct and indirect effects that are compounded. Now for management, they're interested in looking at a variety of different reference points. And so what we did is we said, okay, well, how do different reference points perform in these future simulations? And so we've looked at a suite of reference points based on fishing mortalities. So, for example, fishing mortality to achieve maximum sustainable yield, half of that quantity. We've developed proxies for the current single species target and threshold reference points. We had to use proxies because there's some differences in model structure, but we think that they're representative of the current reference points that are being used. We also looked at the fishing mortality that would achieve 40% of unfished biomass and 75% of unfished biomass. So each of these relates to some of those ERP options that I mentioned earlier in the presentation. So again, we can look at these types of plots and then we can say, all right, well, where do we draw the line? Where do these ERPs plot out? And so I've done that. For these 6 different reference points, I've drawn a line where they fall out, and then you can kind of compare what the consequences are for the yield and for the biomass of these select species. So we can see that fishing for maximum sustainable yield is this line all the way to the right. It was relatively similar to the fishing mortality to achieve 40% B0. And then on the more conservative end, we can see that we have the fishing mortality to achieve 75% of B0, and that was relatively comparable to our proxy for the current single species target reference point. And so this acts as a tool for managers and decision makers to say, well, what are the trade-offs that we want to have? What trade-offs are we comfortable with? And we can do the same type of plot and comparison for that other metric of negatively impacted groups and positively impacted groups. And so using that information, we've tabulated what the impacts are on the relative biomass and relative yield. Here I've focused only on menhaden and striped bass, just because those are some of the key species. So I've ranked these ERPs based on fishing mortality rates. So the most conservative one is this fishing mortality to achieve 75% of B0, and then as we ramp up fishing mortality rate, we see these other reference points. And so we can use this as a tool to compare what the consequences are at these different fishing mortality rates for menhaden, for striped bass, and for the number of groups in the system that are negatively affected or positively affected. So to pull back and highlight some of the major findings, when we're talking about ecosystem approaches to fisheries management and ecosystem-based fisheries management, we have to acknowledge that there are trade-offs and there are going to be winners and losers in the system. And so we saw a range of responses among the 61 different modeled groups in the ecosystem. The groups that were most negatively affected included striped bass, which is of concern for lots of stakeholders. We also noted declines in some of the higher trophic level groups, such as birds, highly migratory species, sharks, and marine mammals. I will note that the data for these groups are a little more uncertain because not as much work is done on those. Bluefish and weakfish, which are also of management interest, we saw that they had modest responses to changes in menhaden fishing. So there's different options on the table for ecological reference points, and they have different consequences for the ecosystem. And these are the types of things that managers have to weigh on either side. And so the results that we developed show that menhaden biomasses, for example, depending on which of the reference points that you use, of the ones that we looked at, biomass will range from 40 to 75%, and the yields will range from 54 to 100% of menhaden's maximum sustainable yield. We also saw declines in striped bass biomass, where they were either 40 to 72% of their max, and then we saw negative and positive impacts. So interestingly, the two most conservative reference points were those to achieve 75% B0, as well as the target reference point used currently for the single species stock assessment. So that's relatively good news. So this is a complex model, complex system, and obviously there are challenges, but that also presents some opportunities. So one of the things that we noticed was that there were some discrepancies between the EWE model and the current stock assessment model. The current stock assessment model is the Beaufort assessment model, or BAM. So we did see that our estimates of biomass depletion for 2013 differed somewhat. In the EWE model, we were estimating that the biomass was at 75% of B0, whereas the BAM estimates it to be at 43%. And so this is the type of thing that should be explored further. We recommend interacting with the BERP to conduct additional sensitivity analyses and compare model outputs, not just from the BAM, but from other models that are being developed. Transitioning from single species approaches to ecosystem approaches also brings challenges dealing with the translation between these different modeling frameworks. And this is something that we can work with that BERP working group to facilitate comparisons, and this is a challenge in lots of different systems. With a complex system, there is a lot of uncertainty in model parameters and predictions. I didn't highlight it in the presentation here, but we do have measures of uncertainty based on Monte Carlo simulations. So we've quantified some of that uncertainty, but we can conduct additional sensitivity analyses that are targeted for specific questions that managers may have. But it also prioritizes research. We really do need to learn more about what's going on with these apex predators, these birds, and large marine mammals. And with the cycle of stock assessment updates, we think it's a good idea to update this ecosystem model to stay in line with those. So for example, the recent stock assessment yielded some pretty different estimates of biomass and fishing mortality rate, and so that's something that we could explore with this ecosystem model, but we would hope that the patterns in the results would be consistent. So to back up even further, just the major model benefits for a tool like this is really that it's specifically designed for Atlantic Menhaden and for this Northwest Atlantic system. So we've included the predators that are of particular importance to the species. So that's a big advantage. Also, by factoring in different age stanzas or sizes of predators and prey, we can account for changes in feeding that occur as organisms get larger. We can also account for size selectivity by the fishery. This is one of the few modeling approaches that account for predator-prey feedbacks where the prey are influencing the predators and the predators are influencing the prey. So it's this dynamic linkage that some other modeling approaches can't handle. Really the key is that this is a tool that we can use to explore these potential trade-offs. So given different alternative management strategies, what are the potential consequences? What are those trade-offs? And use that to help inform long-term strategic planning. So a complex model like this is not intended to provide tactical advice on what the quotas should be next year for a fishery. It's intended to be used in conjunction with other models, providing a longer-term picture of what those trade-offs are. And obviously, given the complexity of these systems, there's lots of other interesting questions that we can explore, and so this model acts as a foundation for examining those. And ultimately, the goal is to advance ecosystem approaches to fisheries management for Atlantic Menhaden, and that's what we hope the model will be used for. So just for the last slide here, just wanted to highlight some of the directions that we can envision going. Specifically with Menhaden management, we would love to continue discussions with the Atlantic States Marine Fisheries Commission to see what their desires are for examining specific sensitivities and trade-offs using our model. We think it's really important to compare our model results with some of the other models that are being developed for those the ERPs. So we can use some multi-model inference to examine how different model assumptions impact conclusions. And we're also interested in updating the model and facilitating comparisons with the existing model. And more broadly, we're hoping to use the model to explore different environmental drivers and productivity regimes within the system. For example, what are the impacts of climate change and how that interacts with fisheries management. We can start to build in spatial dynamics, which are very important given the migratory nature of lots of the species in the system. And we can also use a model like this to start exploring truly ecosystem-based management approaches where we're managing multiple species at the same time or managing the broader ecosystem. So I think there's lots of exciting directions for this. We're very happy and pleased with how far this has come, and we're excited to continue the work. So there are lots of people to acknowledge and have them listed here. So also want to thank LenFest Ocean Program for the funding, but it's been a great working with all these collaborators. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Buchheister. That was really, really great. And we're now going to have questions. So as a reminder, please type your questions into the Q&A panel, and Andre will read them out and provide answers.
Thanks. All right, so I'm getting a few questions here. I didn't notice during the talk, but it looked like at least some people were having trouble with the audio. Hopefully most people were able to hear me okay. But I have a question here from Nicola Meserve. What does the Menhaden fishing mortality in the graphs and the tables represent? So for example, is it biomass-weighted fishing mortality? Is it F on ages 2 to 4, like the current single species biological reference points? So let me go back to the graph there. So this fishing mortality rate is, what is the fishing mortality rate, which is based on biomass, for the medium size class. So this is for ages 1 to 2. So it's not a direct one-to-one comparison to the reference points that the single species model uses. Their reference points focus on, as Nicola mentions here, it's a geometric mean of ages 2 to 4. So that's the reason we used these proxies for the single species target and the single species threshold was for exactly the reason that Nicola is asking. The single species model uses abundance-based fishing mortality rate, and they average things across ages 2 to 4. And so we've translated that into a biomass-based fishing mortality rate for ages 1 to 2. And there's more detail on that in the paper, but so we had to make some conversions of those. All right, so let's see, a question from Aaron Kornbluth. What might the timing be for a future model update, for example, to incorporate new landings data, length at age, et cetera? So if we're updating the model, that would be a good time to make some additional modifications to try to improve the improve comparisons with the single species model. So we have some ideas for that. So there's kind of different levels that we could do for a model update. But if we did the bare bones, just try to update the time series, we'd be looking at several months to accomplish that. But if we were to do additional modifications of the model to improve it, for example, adding spatial complexity and those kinds of things, it would take longer. Let me see if there are any questions popping up here.
Anybody has any more questions, feel free to write them in. And just one question from me, Andre, that I wanted to ask is in going through this process, analyzing the results of the model, was there anything in particular that you didn't see coming that surprised you about the results and sort of changed how you thought about the next steps for the model, how it should be used, anything like that?
Yeah, I think going through the process made me appreciate, the complexity of the system, and as comfortable as it may be to focus on single species models, all of these dynamics are still occurring within the system, and just ignoring those aren't going to make those challenges go away. So at least we're kind of tackling those head on. So it just made me appreciate these complexities, and I think it created lots of new questions of where we might be able to take this. And I think it highlights just the trade-offs also with kind of these management decisions that have to be made. The strong responsive striped bass is something that we want to investigate further. That came out from the parameterization and needing to, and trying to replicate the historical trends as best we could. So I think there's some questions to investigate there. Also, I think we've learned a little bit about how to better, or things that we could change to better connect with the existing single species model. For example, if I were to do this again, I would treat each age class of Menhaden separately, just to make it a little bit easier to compare across models. When we developed this, we were focused on kind of more of a ecological perspective on where we define the grouping. So those are some of the things that we learned that we would change in the future. Let me see, there's another question here from Bia. So Andre, you mentioned uncertainties on model prediction. Moving forward and considering the addition of NWaCS model to the MSE process, how would you inform the uncertainties? So I think the way that we examined uncertainties is by using the Monte Carlo simulations, where we randomly varied those initial parameters for the model. I think an important set of uncertainty evaluations to do is to look at those vulnerability parameters, and that's something that hasn't been plugged into the software package yet, but I know that Karim, Aiden, and some others are working on developing some tools to evaluate the uncertainty to the vulnerability parameters. So for those that, well, Bia knows what those are, but for those that maybe haven't heard that term before, there are some parameters in the model that control the degree of bottom-up and top-down control within different interactions. And so there's no way to empirically determine those, and so we fit the model to existing data and use those parameters. But I think that we need to explore the sensitivity to those values more, and Karim is developing, with collaborators, developing some tools to do that.
All right, I think that was our last question. I want to thank you, Dr. Buchheister, for doing this webinar. This was really informative and interesting, and we're really grateful for your time. And also want to thank Dana here on the LenFest team who really pulled this together. Thank you so much, Dana. And thank you to all of you for joining.
Thank you, Emily, and thanks everyone for listening in. If you have any questions, feel free to follow up by email or take a look at the paper. Be happy to chat with you. Thank you.
Thank you. Bye-bye.